It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors. And I've no intention. Now I've started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this. Terrible.
The humiliation began not with a speech, not with a public statement, but with a closed door at Buckingham Palace House. Camilla arrived expecting access, recognition, and deference. Instead, security stepped forward with quiet firmness and delivered the order that froze the room. She was not to enter. The instruction, they said, came from Kate's office. In that instant, palace power changed shape. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. She looked at the officer as if the words had landed in the wrong room, meant for someone else, someone lower, someone easier to refuse. Buckingham Palace House was not just another royal doorway. It was a private working space inside the palace world, where entry signaled trust, rank, and permission to move close to the center of power. So when the Queen Consort was stopped there, the message reached far beyond one corridor. It said access could be questioned. It said position did not guarantee control. The officer kept his voice low. He repeated that Camilla was not authorized to enter, and this time he added the detail that made her hand tighten around her gloves. The order had come from Kate's office. Not from a confused aide, not from a nervous secretary. From the office of the Princess of Wales, the formal team that manages her schedule, private engagements, and internal royal work. That meant this was not a mistake. It was a boundary drawn with intent. Camilla's face changed before anyone spoke again. The shock did not explode. It settled. Her jaw stiffened, her eyes narrowed, and for a breath she seemed to measure the humiliation in front of the staff watching from a careful distance. Kate was nowhere near the entrance, yet her presence filled the space like a command. Camilla felt that absence more sharply than if the princess had stood there herself. A silent refusal can wound deeper than a shouted one. Security had her name. Security had the hour of her arrival. Security even had the exact door she was expected to use. That was the revelation that turned embarrassment into alarm. Someone had prepared for this moment before Camilla ever stepped from her car. Someone had known she would come, and someone had decided she would not pass. Camilla finally asked the question that made a nearby aide go pale. Did Charles know? The aide looked down too quickly, and the silence answered before any sentence could. The king, the man who should have stood at the center of every palace decision, may not have been the first to learn that his wife had been blocked. Camilla turned away from the entrance, wounded and furious, while upstairs a private call was placed. The person who answered already knew the confrontation had begun, and the closed door was only the first shock. The deeper wound came from the people whose names were now trapped inside the order. Behind every royal command sits a human cost, and this one carried 3. Camilla felt stripped of dignity. Kate felt forced to defend a boundary she had long avoided naming. Charles stood between wife and future queen, knowing any choice would wound someone. What looked like a security decision was really a collision of loyalty, authority, and private pain. Camilla sat inside the car without speaking. The door had closed behind her, yet the refusal kept echoing, as if the officer were still standing there, repeating the same impossible sentence. She had lived through storms, headlines, judgment, and years of being measured against royal memory, but this was different. This happened inside the palace world, where rank usually moved before a person did. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king, was expected to carry a level of access that ordinary staff would never question. That was why the stop felt so brutal. It did not just block her path. It challenged what she believed her position still meant. Kate received the confirmation in a private sitting room, and for 1 second, she closed her eyes. Not in triumph, not in cruelty, in the heavy silence of someone who knew the order had crossed from paper into history. Her office, the formal team that manages her royal work, personal schedule, and internal requests, had become sharper in recent months, because softer boundaries had failed. The Princess of Wales had learned that hesitation inside palace walls could be mistaken for weakness. So when her aide said Camilla had been turned away, Kate opened her eyes and gave the answer that sealed the moment. No exceptions. Charles heard after the refusal had already happened. That detail changed everything. The king was not being asked whether the door should close. He was being told it had already closed, and that his wife had been left outside it. For a monarch, The person who serves as head of the royal institution, timing can become power. If Charles had been protected from the decision, it meant his aides feared the emotional cost. If he had been deliberately bypassed, it meant Kate's office had acted with a confidence that could no longer be ignored. William read the short message from Kate's office and felt his jaw tighten. The prince understood palace language better than most. A brief note could carry more force than a public speech. He knew this was not a small security correction. It was a warning shot inside the family. And once such a warning was heard, nobody could pretend the old order was untouched. Camilla finally lifted her face, and anger replaced the first flash of hurt. Kate stayed still, accepting the weight of what she had done. Charles stood caught between love and duty. William understood the danger before anyone said it aloud. 4 people were now reacting to one closed door, but only one of them knew what had truly triggered the order. To understand why Kate's office moved with such cold precision, the story must return to the private moment that made restraint impossible. No palace rupture begins at the door where the world sees it. It begins earlier, in a quieter room, with a sentence that goes too far. For weeks, tension had been hidden under polite smiles and careful seating plans. Then one private conversation at Kensington Palace became the trigger everyone later remembered as the point of no return. Kate entered that meeting already aware something had shifted. Requests had been arriving through quiet channels, always polite on the surface, always aimed at the same sensitive places. Who could enter certain rooms? Who could see future schedules? Who could influence private gatherings before they became public? Kensington Palace, one of the royal family's main working homes, mattered because it was not only a residence, it was also a control point for the Princess of Wales's private planning, charity work, and family-facing duties. That made every request feel heavier than it looked. One small change could open the door to a larger loss of control. Camilla understood the power of pressure. She did not need to raise her voice to make a room feel smaller. During the private planning meeting for a children's charity event, she challenged Kate's authority directly and said the princess's office was overreaching. The remark landed hard because the charity event was tied to Kate's public identity, her long work around children and early development, and her place as the future queen. A children's charity event means a formal royal project focused on helping young people, and for Kate, this one was personal. So when Camilla questioned her control over it, the challenge was not administrative. It was intimate. Kate sat still. Her face remained calm, but her fingers stopped moving over the briefing notes. An aide noticed it at once, because the room had gone painfully quiet. The princess did not answer with anger. She let the silence do what shouting could not. Camilla, however, took that silence as retreat. The queen consort left believing she had reasserted seniority, believing rank had pressed Kate back into place. William later read the documented account prepared after the meeting. The account recorded the exchange, the challenge, and the final line that changed everything. A documented account is a written internal record of what happened, used so palace offices can track decisions and responsibility. The prince set the pages flat on his desk and told Kate the boundary had to become real, or it would be ignored again. Kate listened, wounded but steady. She knew the memo would not look dramatic from the outside, yet inside the palace, it carried force. It listed restricted access protocols for private spaces connected to her work. That memo became the foundation for the Buckingham Palace House order. The palace could hide a memo, but it could not hide Camilla's fury once she realized the locked door had been prepared days before she arrived. By the time Camilla reached the private corridor, the humiliation had turned into something sharper. She no longer wanted an explanation from security. She wanted Kate. The palace air tightened as aides stepped back, doors closed, and 2 women who had survived years of royal silence finally stood face to face, with no crowd to soften the blow. Camilla entered first, carrying the kind of anger that did not need volume. The private Buckingham corridor mattered because it was away from public ceremony, away from smiling cameras, and away from the soft language royal families use to hide damage. A private corridor is not just a passage. Inside palace life, it is where real decisions are often tested before the world ever hears them. That made this meeting dangerous. There would be no cheering crowd, no official speech, and no easy escape into royal performance. Kate arrived calmly, but calm did not mean weak. She knew the order had already injured Camilla, and she knew the queen consort would not forgive the embarrassment easily. Still, the princess did not step back. She had already accepted the cost when her office sent the instruction, An office order, in plain terms, is a written direction from a royal working team that tells staff what action to take. This one had told security exactly what to do, and now Kate had to stand in front of the woman it had stopped. Camilla demanded to know when Kate decided she had the right to block the king's wife from a palace entrance. Her voice stayed controlled, but every word carried the sting of public insult. The queen consort was not only defending a doorway, she was defending the belief that her marriage to Charles still gave her unquestioned standing inside the palace machine. Kate listened without blinking, then answered quietly that the restriction was not about rank, it was about protecting work, staff, and people Camilla had tried to influence. The words hit harder than anger. Camilla realized the refusal had not come from a nervous guard misreading a message. Security had acted from a written protocol, and that protocol made the access route closed unless the order was formally lifted. Kate then revealed, through the summary sent to Charles's office, that the king had been informed of the concerns, but her team moved before waiting for his emotional reaction. The summary was a brief internal record, meant to explain the reason behind a decision before debate could bury it. Camilla stared at her, wounded in a way pride could not hide. Kate held her ground, but the moment cost her too, because she understood that palace peace had just been broken in her name. As the queen consort left the corridor shaken, Charles was already being brought the file that would force him to choose whether to reverse or uphold Kate's order. And once the file reached him, the conflict stopped being a private clash between two women and became a test of royal authority itself. Charles had spent a lifetime learning that monarchy survives by controlling appearances, but this file offered no graceful escape. On one page sat Camilla's humiliation. On another sat Kate's authority. Between them stood the future of palace discipline. The king read in silence, and for once, the crown on his head felt less like power than a burden. Charles kept his hand on the file longer than he needed to. The access file, meaning the collected papers explaining who was allowed into a royal space and why, had been placed before him with painful care. Inside it were the security order, Kate's office memo, and the notes from the Kensington meeting that had started the chain reaction. Each page mattered, because palace discipline depends on consistency. If one order could be reversed because it embarrassed the wrong person, then every future boundary would become negotiable. The king read the line confirming Camilla had been refused entry, then removed his glasses and set them down without speaking. He was not only reading about procedure, he was reading about his wife being stopped by staff inside the palace world he was meant to command. That detail cut deeply because Charles knew royal authority is built on belief. Staff must believe orders are clear. Family members must believe roles have meaning. The public must believe the institution is not quietly fighting itself behind closed doors. Charles asked the question he had been avoiding. Was Camilla embarrassed in view of staff? The senior courtier standing nearby lowered his voice before answering. A courtier is a trusted palace official who helps manage royal duties, messages, and private decisions. His answer was careful, but it still landed like a blow. Yes, the queen consort had been seen. Yes, the refusal had been witnessed. Yes, the damage was no longer private. The king's face changed with quiet regret. He cared for Camilla, and that made the decision cruel. But he also understood what Kate had risked. If he overturned her office, he would not simply comfort his wife. He would weaken the princess at the exact moment she had tried to protect her work. Kate's authority would look temporary, dependent on whether others found it convenient. That could not happen without cost. The senior courtier then explained the danger in colder terms. Reversing the order would expose palace confusion and make Kate's office look powerless. Keeping it would wound Camilla, but it would prove the palace could still enforce a boundary once drawn. Charles did not sign a punishment. He did something quieter and more final. He allowed the restriction to stand, turning Kate's instruction into palace policy. Camilla heard the news later, and shock gave way to something lonelier. Charles had not attacked her, but he had not rescued her either. The door had been closed by security, defended by Kate, and now quietly upheld by the king. For the queen consort, that made the humiliation impossible to dismiss. The first consequence was not public. It was a room, a silence, and a woman sitting with the knowledge that nobody had come running to undo what had happened. Camilla had expected anger to protect her. Instead, isolation arrived first. The palace continued moving around her, but the invisible line had already been drawn. Camilla sat alone in a smaller reception room, staring at a tray of untouched tea. The room felt too quiet for someone who had entered the day expecting authority to follow her. Her schedule had already been adjusted, and one internal meeting had been moved away from Buckingham Palace House without a dramatic announcement. That mattered because royal schedules are not just diaries. They show who is trusted, who is included, and who is close to the center of decision-making. When a meeting moves away from someone, the message is never accidental. Palace staff began following the new access protocol without discussion. An access protocol, in plain terms, is a set of instructions telling security and staff who may enter certain private spaces and under what conditions. The silence around it made the order feel stronger. Nobody argued in corridors. Nobody rushed to reassure the queen consort. Nobody treated the refusal as a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. Camilla saw that, and the truth grew colder. The door had not simply closed once, it had become a rule. A trusted aide entered carefully, speaking in the soft tone people use when they know comfort may be rejected. The aide told Camilla that these matters often settled after a few conversations, that Charles would surely understand how painful the moment had been. Camilla cut her off before the sentence could soften the wound. "Reassurance means nothing," she said, "after a door has already closed." The words were controlled, but the hurt beneath them was unmistakable. Then the second security note appeared. It confirmed that the restriction applied not only to that day, but to future private office-linked access, unless formally lifted. A security note is a written update sent to staff, so there is no confusion about what rule must be followed. This one mattered because it turned embarrassment into structure. Camilla was not facing one refusal. She was facing a future in which Kate's boundary had force. William understood that force immediately. In a private conversation with Kate, the prince told her the decision would now be challenged through emotion, not procedure. Camilla would not fight the wording first. She would fight the feeling of being humiliated. Kate listened with quiet resolve, but the warning landed heavily because she knew William was right. Charles remained the missing voice in the room, and that absence spoke louder than comfort. Before the palace could decide what the order meant, the king needed to hear from Kate directly, not as a future queen, but as a woman who had finally refused to bend. When Charles asked to see Kate alone, the palace understood the danger. Without aides, titles, or official language, the conversation could become either a wound or a turning point. Kate entered knowing she might be blamed for humiliating Camilla. Charles waited knowing he might have to admit that the younger generation had done what he could not. Kate stepped into the private room with quiet control, but she knew control would not protect her from the weight of the meeting. No aide stood nearby. No secretary waited with softened language. A private royal meeting, in plain terms, is a closed conversation where family duty and palace business collide, without witnesses to protect anyone from the truth. That mattered, because Charles could no longer hide behind procedure. Kate could no longer hide behind her office. They had to speak as people, not symbols. Charles began carefully. He told Kate that blocking Camilla from a palace entrance tied to royal authority was serious, and he did not need to raise his voice for the warning to land. Royal authority means the power attached to rank, duty, and public position inside the monarchy. For the king, that authority was fragile because it depended on everyone believing the palace knew who held control. If the queen consort could be stopped, the entire family would feel the tremor. Kate listened, then answered with a steadiness that surprised him. She said she had not acted to embarrass Camilla. She had acted because boundaries ignored in private become disasters in public. The princess did not speak like someone seeking victory. She spoke like someone who had carried too many quiet pressures and finally understood the cost of silence. Charles looked at her, and for a moment, the monarch seemed less certain than the woman before him. Kate then said the line that made him turn away. The palace often asks women to absorb discomfort quietly, until the damage becomes irreversible. Charles heard Camilla in that sentence. He heard Kate too. He heard years of polished smiles covering private wounds. And the room changed because the truth had finally become impossible to dress in royal language. Kate admitted the Kensington meeting was the final trigger, but not the first warning. Her office had documented smaller intrusions before, through internal notes and dated staff accounts, showing repeated attempts to question access, schedules, and private planning. Charles did not apologize for Camilla. He did something heavier. He told Kate the order would remain because the monarchy could not survive if private authority was constantly undermined. Kate left knowing the decision had cost everyone something. Charles remained behind, aware that he had upheld the future at the expense of peace inside his own home. By the time the meeting ended, the palace had its internal verdict, but the outside world was about to discover the locked door. What began in a private corridor could not stay hidden. Once one image, one headline, and one crowd turned the palace's silence into a national spectacle. By morning, the palace no longer owned the story. The locked door had escaped into public imagination, and Britain woke to a royal image too sharp to ignore. Camilla halted at Buckingham Palace House while Kate's office became the unseen force behind the refusal. What had been whispered behind doors now stared back from every breakfast table. Camilla saw it first over breakfast. She unfolded the paper, stopped breathing for a beat, then folded it once with a precision more dangerous than anger. The front page showed Buckingham Palace gates under the headline, "The Door That Divided the Palace." Buckingham Palace, the main working symbol of the monarchy, matters because its gates are not only metal and stone, they represent who belongs near royal power. Now those gates had become the image of rejection, and Camilla knew the country had been invited to judge her humiliation. Kate watched the same coverage in silence. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. The princess understood that private protection had turned into public judgment, and judgment could cut both ways. The media framed the story as a power shift between the old royal order and the disciplined future represented by Kate and William. Royal order, in plain words, means the accepted structure of rank, duty, and influence inside the family. If that structure was changing, then the world was not only watching Camilla's pain, it was watching Kate's rise. William read the headlines with a stillness that made the room feel colder. The prince knew the public loved a clear battle, but the palace lived with the consequences after the noise faded. He told Kate that support today could become pressure tomorrow, because once people saw her as the person who drew the line, they would expect her never to step back. Kate understood. Strength had given her protection, but it had also made her visible. Charles received the palace statement before it went out. The wording was brief, speaking only of private office protocols and internal access arrangements. A palace statement is an official message released to explain or calm a royal matter, and this one mattered because it reduced a family wound into careful language. The king knew it would not be enough. Camilla knew it too when she left the table without finishing her tea. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the railings. Some defended the queen consort, saying no wife of the king should be stopped that way. Others praised Kate for drawing a line drawn long before. The crowd could argue, the headlines could roar, but the final meaning belonged to the people changed by it. In the end, the story was never only about Camilla being stopped at an entrance. It was about who had the right to protect the future of the monarchy when private pressure threatened public dignity. The closed door became a verdict, not shouted, not celebrated, but final, and everyone inside the palace understood what had been decided. Camilla stood before the mirror and removed her gloves slowly. The silence around her no longer felt like shock. It felt like acceptance, the kind that arrives only after anger has burned through every excuse. Her refusal at Buckingham Palace House had begun as a security action, but it had become something larger, something colder. Buckingham Palace House, the private palace space tied to royal work and access, mattered because it represented closeness to power. Being stopped there told Camilla that rank alone no longer opened every door. Kate's office emerged from the storm changed, but not broken. It did not look rebellious now. It looked disciplined, protective, and unwilling to let private influence override institutional boundaries. Institutional boundaries, in plain terms, are the rules that keep royal work separate from personal pressure, so one person's position cannot quietly control everyone else's duties. That mattered because the monarchy survives on order. Without order, family feeling becomes palace policy, and palace policy becomes chaos. Charles entered the room knowing comfort would not be enough. He told Camilla privately that the order had been painful, but necessary. The king did not say it with cruelty. He said it with the tired weight of a man who understood that love could not always lead the institution. Camilla looked at him, and the room became still because both knew the truth. He would not reverse it. He would not punish Kate for drawing the line. He would let the door remain closed. William and Kate stood together after the storm, not celebrating, not smiling, not acting as if victory had arrived. The prince understood that a new line of succession power had quietly become visible. The line of succession means the order of people expected to inherit the throne, but here it meant more than future titles. It meant the future way of ruling, the future tone of the palace, the future discipline that would shape every private decision. The final truth was simple and sharp. The monarchy did not collapse from the confrontation. It clarified itself through it. Camilla learned that access was no longer entitlement. Charles learned that restraint could hurt more than command. Kate learned that silence had limits. William learned that the future had already begun pressing against the present. The refusal marked the end of automatic deference and the beginning of a stricter palace order, where loyalty must respect boundaries, even at the highest level. There is no unresolved mystery left. The door closed on Camilla that day, but it opened a new chapter for Kate's authority, Charles's restraint, and the monarchy's future discipline. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.